Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us today. And we're continuing our journey through the Daodejing and closing in on the end here. We're currently on chapter 79 out of 81. So just a couple more to go. So let's go ahead and jump right in. When settling a major grudge, surely some resentment remains. So the idea here is there some kind of conflict that you work out with somebody. But even if you get it worked out, there seems to like still be some resentment behind, right? And so it's just making an observation here that we can have these conflicts that get resolved, but it doesn't get rid of everything. And so it asks the question then, how can this be considered good? Which is kind of interesting because we normally think about, well, if we resolve a conflict, of course, somebody might still have hurt feelings, but the fact that we got it resolved is a good thing. It's kind of the goal thing that we want to try and achieve. But here they're asking the question, how is that good? How can that be good if that's still the case, if there's still that resentment remaining? There's another translation of this that I think kind of brings out the thought a little bit more clearly, too. Says, when a serious resentment is reconciled, some resentment certainly remains. Thus, reconciliation cannot be considered the best way. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Maybe before we go on to the next part, I'll just see if you guys have any thoughts about where they might be going with this or why they might be suggesting that reconciliation isn't the best way. Or if you have any thoughts on what might be the better way.
Makes me think of a book that I've read called Radical Forgiveness,
Mm,
that sort of about letting go of grudges and resentments.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like you're erasing history. It's still gonna have happened. And maybe it's not perfect, but it's still progress.
Yeah, it definitely is, at least the way that when these types of issues are presented to me, and I've been concerned about different types of reconciliation movements and how they try to bring about reconciliation between, victims of violent crime and the perpetrators. And there's things like the truth and was it Truth and Peace or no, Truth and Justice reconciliation that they were doing in South Africa, and a lot of these other movements to try and figure out how to bring about that resolution. And a lot of it focuses heavily on exactly what Dan was saying about that idea of forgiveness and how we can practice that. Um, but for some reason here, it's saying that this isn't necessarily the best way to go about it, which is intriguing to me because this is, uh, I am not aware of too many people who actually can even think of, well, what would be better? Like, what would be the alternative? Other than maybe if we think about some of the prior chapters, there's a heavy emphasis on how do we prevent things from blowing up in the first place by dealing with them when they're small, right? So we can see that there could be, this preventative move. But in spite of our best efforts at preventing things from growing into big issues, there's still the possibility of finding ourselves in a situation that needs to get resolved. But if the reconciliation isn't the best way to go about it, well, what are we going to do? So I wanted to stop and reflect on a couple of different approaches. So forgiveness, we've brought up. The other possibility is this idea of acceptance. And this one can be a little tricky because it can sound very, well, both of them run the risk of sounding very passive or non-assertive or not standing up for yourself or your rights or the things that are important to you and create a situation where you're likely to be walked on or taken advantage of or the usual concerns along these lines. But when we think about the emphasis on forgiveness, frequently the idea is that if we don't forgive, then we've got this stuff eating us up inside, and it's going to cause a problem for us personally, with our own health and whatnot, that if we hold that grudge, it doesn't do anything to the other person. It's only affecting us, assuming you're not in some type of, multi-generational clan warfare or something. But, just in general, if you've been wronged by someone and you hold on to that resentment, it's not good from a health perspective. Now, the other perspective on that is this idea of acceptance. And this is, if we think back to something like the Serenity Prayer, where it's asking to be this idea of being able to accept the things that we cannot change. So there's all kinds of events that happen in our life that we don't have any control over. And this can include things like people wronging us or doing something that causes us harm or loss or even just hurts our feelings. So if we are understanding those types of actions within this concept of acceptance of things we don't have control over, if we're able to simply accept those things, that's another way that we can deal with those, where we're not holding on to that grudge or that issue. But it can feel as though there's nothing going on. At least with forgiveness, there's this idea that I'm taking the higher road. I'm doing something, and potentially the victimizer, whoever's causing the offense, might even find our forgiveness something that can help them to resolve what happened as well. Sometimes the grievance can be so difficult, it's hard to know what to even do. I was reading this one book where this guy is telling the story about how his neighbor was having fun just playing with the kids and his brother, and accidentally killed his brother. And the challenge of his mother needing to be able to forgive the neighbor for accidentally killing their son. And, it's one of those situations you never want to have to think about or have to deal with, for sure. But the person who was, in this case, guilty, not even maliciously, but just accidentally, had a very difficult time coping with it himself until she was actually able to offer that forgiveness. And that forgiveness then also helped that healing then on both sides. So there's a way that can have a very powerful effect that feels like there's still something that we are actually doing, whereas the idea of acceptance can feel like we're pretending it didn't matter or nothing happened, right? People get this confused sometimes with forgiveness, that they think that if I'm forgiving somebody, I'm saying it didn't matter. And that's not actually the case with forgiveness. In forgiveness, we're saying that there was wrong, that there's something that's due me, but I am intentionally foregoing that so that we can bring about this reconciliation. It's very active, whereas acceptance feels like we're just brushing it under the rug or not paying attention to it. So it can feel very passive and challenging in that respect. But I think that is not exactly what they're trying to communicate with the idea of acceptance. Acceptance is more about there's things that have happened that we don't have any control over. And regardless of how we feel about it, it's not going to make any difference. The question is, okay, well, what do we do going forward? And what are the things that I actually have control over? And how do we approach it from that perspective? So maybe before I continue with my thoughts on this, I'll pause and see if you guys have any thoughts or experiences with either of these approaches.
I really love this conversation because I'm one of three siblings. I'm the youngest, and my parents, especially my dad, like they weren't awesome growing up. And my two siblings hold a lot of resentment for both of my parents. And they kind of have a perspective that's like they're angry at them and they kind of pity themselves for it. But my perspective has recently been, at least in the last 10 years, like they are just a product of how they grew up. And so now we're a product of how they grew up, and that's not necessarily like on them, and it's just is what it is. And if you just accept it and do what you can with it, then you're going to have a whole different experience in life than living with that self-pity and just kind of stewing in it. But if you can accept it, then you can have a much better relationship with them and maybe even help them get through, what they obviously went through as kids too. So I resonate with this a lot, I think.
So did you find then that for yourself, it was more the route of acceptance rather than forgiveness?
Yeah, for
Interesting.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like talking to them about it too, like I'm pretty close with my sister, and I think when I talk about it, she thinks that I'm talking about forgiveness.
Mm.
And she's like, no, like they did this and that and this other thing. And like, it's they did it, like I can't believe they would do that, or, and it's like, yes, they did. But like, if you hold on to that and just fester in that, that's not helpful either.
Mm. Anybody else have some thoughts?
Well, I have quite a few because this is something that I've given quite a bit of thought to. And actually, it's kind of a challenge to condense my thoughts on this. But one angle is that it's well, I think that the ideas of security and attachment theory actually shed a lot of light on this. So are you guys familiar with attachment theory? There's basically four types of attachment. When humans attach to one another, form bonds, and there's four types. There's secure attachment, which is the healthy kind. Then there's anxious attachment, which is kind of clingy and no, don't leave me kind of attachment. And then which is like attachment style.
Okay.
Uh, and then there's avoidant, which is fine, I don't need you anyway. Go away, I don't care kind of style. And then there's disorganized, which is uh, go away, no, come back. No, go away, no, come back. It's kind of bounces back and forth between anxious and avoidant. And I really think that the ability to forgive or accept either one, to let go of resentment and grudges, has a lot to do with well, it depends a lot on security. The more secure a person is in their own being, the easier it is for them to forgive or accept. And I remember, well, there's one passage from the Bible I've heard where somebody says something to Jesus about forgiving, and he's like, there's nothing to forgive. That is kind of the idea of acceptance, where uh, you realize that in a sense we are all a product of our life experiences, and we're all affected by influences outside of us, and we're all sort of interrelated. So there's really no point in blaming or judging anyone. It takes to I think it takes a great deal of security to hold that perspective, and also to want to forgive, because to forgive, you have to want to, you have to like make a conscious choice. Well, rather than feeling resentment, I would rather feel warmth and positive feelings towards this person, or at least neutral. And so you have to choose to do that. Whereas if it's like some stranger that you don't know or care about, it's like, why do I want to feel good towards them anyway? I'm fine resenting that person. Or if the avoidant attachment style is more like, okay, fine, I just don't care. It's not it's acceptance in the form of like apathy or numbness. Okay, fine, I just don't care. I don't have any feelings towards that person, positive, negative, just neutral. They're nothing to me. Um, to actually want to have positive feelings again towards somebody who hurt you in some way requires a great deal of security. And then another perspective that has to do with ego in the sense of uh, the ego, it has to do with perspective in the sense of there's the ego perspective, which is like the perspective of the individual. I am an individual and I have this history and these things have happened to me and these other individuals have done these things, versus the universal perspective, which is like the universe is just here. Everything is happening. It's all a big mesh of cause and effect. And there is no I or me or you. There's just the universe and consciousness, and everything is just happening. From that perspective, the idea of you doing something to me just, I mean, doesn't make any sense. There's no one to forgive or to blame or to hold a grudge against, because there are no individuals. There's just a unity. So I, uh, I always find that I can switch back and forth. Like if I switch into my ego perspective, I can see, yeah, I'm a person. These other people did things to me. But then if I switch into universal perspective, none of those concepts even have any meaning.
Yeah, and I think we see aspects of that even within the Taoist perspective too, where they've taken Tao to out beyond just the human interaction realm of what that way is to more of that cosmic perspective, right? That gives more of that indifference to the universe and how things function. So, yeah, there's definitely aspects of that that come into play, not nearly as common in our culture because a lot of people, maybe most people, don't think of themselves as part of a larger whole that's not really individuated into individuals. But yeah, that's definitely a direction that can go with that too. Chaz, I didn't want to cut you off. Did you have any thoughts?
Oh, I got a whole lot of thoughts, but I won't go too deep. But yeah, I kind of got a similar background to Taylor. Maybe not quite as much the same, but similar. But when I look at it, I see the difference between forgiveness and acceptance is forgiveness is something you have control of versus acceptance is about things you don't have control of. Um, I've done a lot of, let's say, soul searching in the past year of just kind of like going through of trying to figure out why I act about certain things, certain ways or whatnot. And yeah, like forgiveness is whenever you have control over it's something that's usually affecting you specifically or whatever. Something happened to you, you have the control to forgive and let things go, whatever your form of forgiveness is. And then acceptance is, in my mind, was the phrase, it is what it is. Those are things that are out of your control. Um, there's like, I have family members that act a certain way, and I'm like, I wish you never did act that way, whatever. But it's out of my control. I can't change that. So I accept it, and it helps you move forward. So then you can go on with your life in a better, more positive attitude.
I like that thought of like forgiveness is what you can control and acceptance isn't. I think also forgiveness is their peace and acceptance is your peace.
Well, it's an interesting, even with that last piece there, Taylor, because one of the challenges sometimes for people to offer forgiveness is, well, they haven't repented. They haven't owned up to their part of it. They're not actually sorry about anything, right? And so this
Yeah.
this is where I think what Chaz was saying about forgiveness is on the side of things that you have control over is it's not about what the other person does, whether they feel sorry about it or not. I can still offer forgiveness in order to heal myself. Um, and it's independent of what the other person does or not. And they can choose to either receive it or not. And they will, in order to receive it, there's a certain amount of acknowledgement that has to happen that, yeah, I did do something wrong. And I acknowledge that. So then I can actually receive that forgiveness. Yeah, a lot of interesting, what's the way to phrase it? But, because we're such social creatures, we're bound to have interactions where we step on each other's toes. And how we deal with that is very complex, and there's a lot of different approaches to it.
Yeah, the dynamics, I would say, are complex.
Yeah, for sure. And so if we bring it back to this opening line here, that's saying that even if there's a reconciliation, even if I offer forgiveness, but maybe the other person's still upset, or maybe I say I offer forgiveness, but really I'm still holding on to the resentment, right? That there's this issue that they're suggesting that just trying to go about doing reconciliation maybe isn't the best way because it still leaves resentment behind. So, if we look at these two primary ways of addressing the issues, then I want to just kind of unfold a couple of underlying thoughts that's kind of along the lines of what Dane was bringing up when he was bringing in more of that cosmic perspective. Oops. The first one is forgiveness is coming from the perspective that there was something that was due me that was denied, whether that's respect or whatever the issue is. Maybe you borrowed money, you didn't pay it back. There's something that somebody owed me that they didn't live up to. And forgiveness is essentially the idea of saying, yes, I know that this is something that was actually due me, but I'm intentionally letting it go. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but I'm choosing not to extract, what's due me in this situation in order to move forward in some way. But the first question then that I think from a Taoist perspective would be asked is, am I actually owed anything? And this maybe I'll just pause and see what you guys think about that. We might think that there's stuff that's owed us, but is that real?
I've quickly learned and accepted in my life that you are owed nothing in this world.
The sooner you can accept that, the more at peace you'll be, I think. And the people that offer up things instead of owing them to you are the people you want to have in your life.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a transaction aspect to it, I think, with what you're saying, Taylor, that if it's not based on a, give get type of situation, but it's just freely offered, that's different
Mm-hmm.
than feeling like somebody owes it to you. Yeah.
Yeah, or like, oh, like I'm older than you, you should respect me, or, anything like that, feeling like you're owed because you make more money or you're in a higher position or you're older or for any reason that anybody thinks they're owed anything from anyone. uh you're not owed anything from anyone. And I think if you can accept that and treat people in that mindset, you're probably going to be a lot kinder to people, and they're probably just going to offer it up anyway because you're not making them feel like they owe you something. So they're gonna freely give it to you. Exactly, Chaz. Yeah, treat the janitor the same way you'd treat the CEO. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. So that is a tough one for a lot of people because it's really easy to be, in a sense, offended sometimes. I don't mean like in the like what's sometimes talked about like the snowflake thing, right? But I mean, it's it doesn't take much sometimes for people to push our buttons because we are very our our image of ourself is really defined through our interactions with other people. And so when there's something that breaks down in our interactions with other people, it can feel like an affront to the self. And so that's where that it's easy for that offense to come in, when somebody's treating you in a way that's inappropriate or what we would consider inappropriate. But starting with that perspective, I might want these things, but I'm not actually owed them, is a really different kind of a perspective because this takes away really how that concept of forgiveness technically works. Because forgiveness is saying, yep, there was something that was due me, but I'm choosing to forego it. And so when we're thinking about a contrast between forgiveness and acceptance, the first thing that makes a big difference here is that acceptance is starting from the position that nobody's actually owed anything. So if that's the case, then the process of forgiveness becomes a bit different. Now, I know people don't necessarily think of it in these terms, and they sometimes will conflate forgiveness and acceptance and use them almost interchangeably. But what I would suggest here, if we want to try and refine this thought a little bit more, is if we've really focused on this idea that I'm not actually owed anything, and really incorporate that. It's one thing to say it's another thing to really believe it and feel it, right? So if we've been able to incorporate that into the way that we look at things, then acceptance becomes an easier way to handle those different infractions. It's even hard sometimes to know how to talk about them because if you say infraction or if you say wronged or whatever, disrespected, it's all those concepts are based on the idea that there's something that somebody did owe you that they're not living up to in terms of the, social contract between people. So it's not to say that we can't create conditions in which there's something about somebody owing each other. So we might form something like a legal fiction in which somebody can take a loan or something like that, where there's some type of contract, right? And we might have certain expectations within our culture that we don't just walk around hitting people or things along those lines. So we can still have this idea of an infraction, but if we elevate that to this is an infraction against something that we have collectively agreed to, as opposed to something that's intrinsically owed to me, that makes a difference in how we process what's happened, which would be maybe the key distinction when we're thinking the difference between forgiveness and acceptance. The other piece of this is that we like to carry the thought that things could have been otherwise, right? That if they just would have done this different, then this would have happened, and then none of this problem would have existed. Why didn't they just do that, But obviously, we cannot go back in time to change anything. And there's still the question of even if we could roll the clock back, is it actually possible to do anything other than what actually happened? Now, as you know, coming from a determinist perspective, I would say there's no way to do anything different. So there's no way things could have ever been otherwise. So to hold on to this idea of things could have been otherwise only becomes more self-inflicting wounds, right? Because we're hung up on wanting something that can't be. And sometimes it's just like in the abstract, because obviously we can't go back in time. But if we're holding on to the idea that if we just did, we could have done it different, either my own actions or somebody else's, right? Sometimes we'll beat ourselves up. Why didn't I do that? Here we can see, or maybe wrestle with the idea, if that's not possible, if it's not a reality that things could have been different, then we have to let that go as well. And I think that is another key element of how we think of things from that acceptance perspective versus the forgiveness perspective. And I'll probably just pause again to see if you have some thoughts on this before we go to the next slide.
To me, these both seem, well, these both relate to the difference between the egoic perspective and the universal or cosmic perspective.
Yeah.
The one of my sayings or ideas is, in 4D space-time, there's a past, a present, a future, but in 5D hyperspace-time, the entire past, present, and future all exist simultaneously now, and kind of like the whole universe is one giant Feynman diagram, if you know what that is, and a giant five-dimensional, 5+ dimensional Feynman diagram. And so there's actually just one past, one future, one course through history for all of existence, and that's the cosmic perspective. And from that perspective, the idea of anything that you think could have been different than it was is just your imagination. It's just you imagining something. It's fabricated. It's fictional. And as far as owing anything, obviously the concept of owing is not a cosmic concept from the perspective of the totality of all that is. There's no concept of owing, but from the egoic perspective, owing is a thing that can be constructed, like if there's an agreement that's made, for example. But there are also needs that we all have as humans, as living organisms, and I think that's a different concept than owing. We have needs; they can either be met or not met. Like, for example, you could say you're not owed anything from the universe, so you're not owed care and love from your parents, but it is a need. It is a need that all babies have, a need to be touched and cared for, and humans have needs to be cared for and considered. So regardless of feeling like you're owed something, we do have needs. And one of the concepts from NVC, nonviolent communication, is positive emotions are emotions that we feel when our needs are met. And what we call negative emotions are the emotions that we feel when our needs are not met. So in that sense, the emotions that we feel are kind of signaling whether our needs are being met or not. And then there's also the functional perspective, kind of an evolutionary psychology perspective, that everything exists for a reason. We have the emotional responses that we do for a reason, and there's a logic to grudges. If somebody does something that hurts you, you hold a grudge against them so that you will avoid them, or possibly if they know you're holding a grudge, possibly it can influence their behavior. That's the evolutionary psychology purpose of emotions, is to influence the behavior of others. So if you have a store and somebody steals from you, you don't let them back into your store again. There's a logic and a rationale to it. And then acceptance would be, you accept that this is the way it is. Okay, I accept that this person is a thief and I'll just never have them as a customer. Whereas forgiveness is, acceptance leads to a place of kind of neutrality. Forgiveness, in my mind, leads to a place of coming back to love. Like if somebody is a close friend or family member that you do care about on a deep level, and they hurt you, you might be feeling hurt for a time, but you want to forgive them because you want to get back to feeling love. And when you forgive someone like that, you're not just at a place of neutrality, like I don't care either way. You're at a place of actually loving them again, and and not like that's what forgiveness means to me. Is you come back to actually loving someone, and you're no longer holding it against them. You understand why they did what they did, or you understand how in a way it was your fault, or you're just you come back to a place of love because that's what you choose to feel for this person. But that's not really doable in an evolutionary psychology sense unless that person displays the awareness to realize what they did, realize the effect it had on you, and be apologetic in some sense. Because if somebody doesn't realize how they hurt you, then that means maybe they can do it again. So it doesn't make logical sense to forgive, or in the sense of like letting them back into your space because they might hurt you again.
Yeah, there's definitely some aspects of how we have to recognize what we're learning from these interactions, right? So there's certain types of behavior that if somebody's exhibiting it, even if we're able to accept it or on the forgiveness side, doesn't mean that we put them back in that same context to allow it to continue. So yeah, it's definitely an important point to bring out. Also, if people were curious about that nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg is the originator of that, and it's an interesting read for sure. Yeah, the other piece I would add in there from that acceptance side, in terms of restoring the emotional aspect of the relationship, is that acceptance also comes, I find, with the ability to have enhanced compassion. And so compassion, I think, is also a mechanism by which those relationships can also be restored, where we still don't have to, operate in that forgiveness side. It can still restore that emotional bond through the acceptance with the idea of compassion. Um, but yeah, they're just different approaches. I think that in trying to decipher this particular passage in the Tao Te Ching anyway, right? That where they're coming from is there's something that they're seeing as deficient with reconciliation, which in this case I would associate with the idea of forgiveness, and that the alternative to that would be the idea of acceptance. But well, let's look at the rest of the chapter and see how this plays out. And this isn't to say to anybody, don't practice forgiveness. You have to focus on acceptance. This is just, we're exploring the different concepts of the different ideas, and hopefully you'll find something that resonates with you and how you can, incorporate more of this into your life, because we don't want to be carrying around a bunch of baggage, whether we're dealing with it through forgiveness or acceptance. we have to find a way forward. And this is just the Taoist approach and how they're perceiving it.
I'm telling everyone that I forgive no one for the rest of my life, and it's Jim Jones' fault.
Yeah. Jim Jones said not to forgive. Isn't that funny? Okay. They're going to say, yeah, I thought he was a cult leader. Okay. So, therefore, the sage holds the left contract and does not blame other people. The concept here is that they would have a way of writing out essentially like a contract on, I think it was a piece of bamboo or something like that, and they would break it in half. So sometimes they would have, in different cultures, ways to kind of create like a left and a right side of something by breaking it so that they were unique. You couldn't just have another piece and say this is the other half of the contract. It had to fit together. So it's just kind of an interesting way to create kind of like a legitimacy or authenticity to prevent forgery. So the thought here is that, yeah, we enter into agreements, in this case, something that's a little bit more formalized, socially derived, and the sage, it says, is going to hold on to their side of it, But here it's kind of an interesting translation. It says it does not blame other people. So my guess is where they're going with this in the translation is that if somebody's not living up to the other side of the contract, that they're not blaming the other person, is how they're where they're going with this translation. There's another one I have here from Feng in English says, but do not exact their due. So here we're getting into this idea, like even though we have this contract, and maybe it's a literal contract, or maybe it's more like the social contract, but they're not, in some sense, trying to extract or force or compel somebody to live up to their side of it. They're concerned about living up to their side. And so if we think about this, what do I have control over versus what I don't have control over? They're focusing on the part that they have control over. Am I living up to my side of the contract to the degree that it's in my power to do so? And on the other side, it's not something that they necessarily feel like they have control over, which is probably true. And so they have a different way that they hold on to that. That's going to create, if we're thinking about that acceptance and the different things that we don't have control over, then this is going to obviously alleviate a lot of creating the conflicts in the first place, right? So if we think about in the other chapters where they're trying to catch things when they're little before they get big, this would be one of the ways that they do that, that they enter into agreements, maybe with the understanding that the other person is not going to be able to live up to their side of it, and they're preemptively almost ready for that. We have a thought within our family about if we lend money to family, that it's always with the understanding, I've got to be okay with never getting this back again, right? And it's kind of that idea, because we don't want to create a rift in the family over something like money. And so in order to avoid that, we'll have kind of like this prearranged thought to ourselves, at least, that I've got to be okay with this never coming back if I'm going to do this, so that we don't create a rift. Similar kind of an idea here. Where are we at on time? We got a couple minutes here. So then it gets into first saying that the way of reconciliation can't be the right way because it always leaves resentment behind. Then it says, therefore, the sage entering into these contracts pays attention to their side of it, but doesn't work on how do they control the other side of that arrangement working out. And so here they're saying kind of a contrast then between the sage and the non-sage. Those with inner power, which is here that again, that concept or that character, Da. So within the Daodejing, Da is the idea of how Tao is manifest. So when things properly express and manifest the natural way of things, it's demonstrating Da. And for pretty much the whole of the natural world, they can't help but manifest Da. It's only within humans where we have the capacity to try and go against it, even though we can't be successful at it, but we can attempt to. It's those then that are actually operating from within that position of having that natural way of things flow through them. Says those with inner power, or those with Da, maintain the contract. And again, if we think about that prior line with the sage, it's our side of it. It's our obligation that we put on ourselves for living up to the types of contracts that we enter into. It says those without Da collect the tax. And so here, bringing in this idea of tax, I think they're trying to talk about not just simply what's owed them, but if there's discrepancies, or if somebody's late, or if somebody struggles with being able to fulfill it, then there's this expectation that there's even more that's due. And maybe by saying, okay, if this is 5 days late, there's going to be a late penalty, that this becomes an effort of trying to control or to enforce the other side of it. And so the contrast here is saying that, again, in recognition that we don't have that kind of control over the other, that that the sage isn't attempting to apply these levels of coercion, whereas somebody who's not operating from that position of duh is going to do whatever they can to coerce the type of behavior that's needed from the other person. So there's that coercion aspect, which seems like in this case is coming back to the idea that there's something that we're actually owed, right? That so if we start from the premise that we nobody actually owes us anything, the universe doesn't owe us anything, then we can kind of see how these fit together a bit. It's not that we can't enter into contracts, but we have to have ways of thinking about how we enter into these contracts that are going to be non-manipulative if possible. And this is always an interesting thing in our culture because we have this thought, right, that we could be this big, powerful bank that has all these resources, and somebody who doesn't have much resources is in a dire straits and they need a loan for something. Their car broke down and they need to get a new car. And so they enter into this contract, and it's with heavy, let's say, interest rate or late payment penalties or whatever that's not really fair, but yet will claim that, well, they willingly entered into the contract. They agreed to the contract, so they willingly did it. But willing is a really interesting concept in those unequal power arrangements. And so, in order to have the types of arrangements where we enter into contracts with people, but we're not putting that coercive aspect on there, is going to require a very different social situation where we feel more comfortable entering into arrangements with people that they're actually going to be able to live up to it. And if they can't, for some reason, that we're somehow going to be okay with that. It's a very different way of organizing society if you're going to be able to have this way of interacting with each other that is not based on power differences and power imbalances. So this would require much more of a, let's say, I don't like to use the term egalitarian because that implies other things that everybody's equal, and that's not exactly the case. But it's more that everybody's an equal player in a sense, right? And maybe taking Dane's thoughts to mind here about we learn lessons from people we have bad experiences with. So maybe if I see that this person frequently does not repay somebody, I'm probably not going to get into a financial arrangement with them that's going to be something that's going to be devastating to me if they don't hold up to it. So it's not that we don't have any wisdom in terms of how we enter into contracts, but we do contracts in a different way. We do them in a non-coercive way as opposed to a coercive way. And that's kind of a big thought there. So I'll see if you guys have some feedback on that.
Yeah,
I
I
wonder
kind
what
of
the
do.
sage would think about interest.
Sorry, what was that, Taylor?
I said, I wonder what the sage would think about interest.
Well, that's kind of what we're talking about there with the tax, right? Yeah.
Sorry, go
Okay.
ahead, Chaz.
Oh, good. It was just making me think of an old friend of mine. When we were younger, he always walked around with like a chip on his shoulder. He was always angry, and it was always because he felt like he was due something from somebody, or hey, I helped this person and they should give me something back. Like they owe me for that. And he was always ended up being very bitter because of it. And it wasn't until like in recent years with age and some maturity that he finally kind of realized like that's not going to happen. And he's a much more peaceful person now because I think he realized like you can't go living your life expecting to be the tax collector. You know, you can't go in expecting to have something in return for every little thing in this world. And if you just kind of move forward with, I'm going to do something nice with no expectations, I'm going to live a much more peaceful life. And like it's been like a 180 turn for him where he's a much more calm and relaxed and just more peaceful person than he used to be 10 years ago.
Well, we're coming up on just a couple minutes here, so we'll go to the end of it. The way of heaven is free of favoritism. And this is one of the things that we talked about going back again with what Dane was saying from more of that cosmic perspective, from that the Tao of heaven and the Tao of nature, the Tao of the universe. There is no favoritism. There is no bias. Everything just unfolds in a very, in a sense, impersonal way. And so then it concludes with saying, it constantly stays with the adept person. And I like this translation using the concept adept because I think that plays better into the Taoist perspective. Frequently, this is translated as the good person, but that's bringing in very much again, this value judgment that doesn't even really make sense in this case of favoritism, right? Because then it would seem like, well, if you're good, then the way of heaven is going to be with you. But here it's the idea that the person who's skilled, right? The person who has mastered how they incorporate Da in their life, or Tao, and it's manifest as Da, that for the adept person, this way of heaven is going to be something that is with them. It's the way that they operate and carry themselves in their lives. So we'll bring it back to our discussion here. We've got just a minute or so left. Any final thoughts on this one?
There's a poem by Mother Teresa that I like. People are often unreasonable, illogical, and self-centered. Forgive them anyway. If you are kind, people may accuse you of selfish, ulterior motives. Be kind anyway. If you are successful, you will win some false friends and some true enemies. Succeed anyway. If you're honest and frank, people may cheat you. Be honest and frank anyway. What you spend years building, someone could destroy overnight. Build anyway. If you find serenity and happiness, they may be jealous. Be happy anyway. The good you do today, people will often forget tomorrow. Do good anyway. Give the world the best you have, and it may never be enough. Give the world the best you've got anyway. You see, in the final analysis, it's between you and your God. It was never between you and them anyway.
I like that. All right, well, maybe we'll use that to bring this to a close. I want to thank you for joining us today. And if you're watching this as a video and you'd like to be a part of our discussion, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get a weekly email with our latest videos, as well as links to where we gather Friday mornings online, or if you happen to be in the Southern California area, where we gather in person. All right, guys, take care.
Bye. Thanks, Jen.